Okay, lesson 9. The yamas and the niyamas coming to a conclusion in a very interesting way. The subject is Svadhyaya, self-study. Now, self-study seems to be presented as something that you must do. Sit down and study yourself. But reality is very different. And that's why it is the conclusion of the yamas and the niyamas. Because studying the yamas and niyamas, of course, is part of your beginning journey on the path of yoga. So you not only study yama niyama, you're practicing. You're practicing asana. You started observation, slowly moving towards concentration meditation. Svadhyaya is a natural consequence of yoga practice. Not something that you sit down and do and say, let's study myself now. It just doesn't work like that. Now, at the introduction workshop, I may have asked, how many yogas exist? Because if you don't know so much about yoga, there is the impression that there are many different kinds of yoga. The reality is, there is only one yoga. There are many modern yogas these days for commercial purposes, to make money. But also before yoga became popularized, it appeared as if there are different kinds of yogas, because there was bhakti yoga, there is Kriya Yoga, there is Jnana Yoga, there is Raja Yoga, there is Karma Yoga, there is Hatha Yoga. Where does that come from? If there is only one yoga? All these yogas that I just mentioned, they are not practices. They are stages of development that you go through. Bhakti Yoga, for example, is the yoga of serving. That is not something that you do. That is something that happens naturally because your heart opens up and you develop empathy and compassion. And that naturally leads to an urge or a wish to start doing good things. For family, for friends in need that you know, for society. That stage of development, that is called Bhakti Yoga. We will come back to Bhakti Yoga when we discuss the heart with some funny anecdotes. It's not the point today, but this is the path of yoga starts with your active participation. That stage, the beginning stage, is called Kriya. They add the word yoga to that, but actually that gives the false impression that this is a form of yoga. It's actually not. It's a stage. Kriya contains the stem word kr, which you also find in karma. What does it mean? It means do. But not just do, because karma actually also just means do. No, I should not use the word just, because not just. Kriya Yoga means doing things in a very particular way, the way suggested by your yoga books. Starting doing things in the yoga way. Stop moving, stand still. Sit down, close your eyes and do nothing for a moment. Starting doing things practicing mindfulness. stopping doing things without being aware of what we do. I make it sound very complicated, but Kriya Yoga is basically the stage where you start practicing asana, where you start studying the yoga philosophy, where you start practicing energy control, meditation, contemplation, all the active elements of yoga. If you do that correctly, the next stage appears naturally. Jnana Yoga. What is jnana? Jnana is knowledge. Jnana is wisdom. Something that we now try to obtain through formal education. When yoga was developing, formal education didn't exist. Studying from books, studying all kinds of different subjects. Yoga was the form of education, but not by imposing all kinds of subjects on you that you're not really interested in, or some you are and some you're not, but simply by awakening consciousness. That then naturally leads to a quest for knowledge. Knowledge in what? Knowledge in things that only you are interested in, not imposed by a teacher, but just naturally you feel interested in. And that always starts with the self. The first thing a human being becomes conscious of is the self. And the first thing that a human being becomes curious of when they develop awakening consciousness is the self. That is the consequence of the first stage. If you don't practice yoga correctly, I mentioned it many times before already, this stage does not occur. Doing exercise is good for health and what have you. It stimulates the production of all kinds of hormones that make you feel good, that make you feel happy, that regulate the functioning of the organs and the glands and the brain and what have you. Exercise is good. And it may lead even to a little bit of jnana. Healthy mind in a healthy body. But there's nothing like yoga. In yoga, what you do in normal exercise, you do on steroids. It is so concentrated and so focused towards that development, the awakening of consciousness. Jnana occurs. You become a natural scientist. You start to investigate naturally anything that you feel attracted to. So not imposed superficially, but based on what you feel you are interested in. It's a natural process. The next stage, Kriya, Jnana, Karma. There are many stages in between, especially between here and Karma. But Karma Yoga is in fact considered the highest stage of yoga. Here you see again the stem word kr. But it also means doing, but it has another meaning than it has here. Because here, karma, when you have engaged in the practice of yoga and gone through that development, growth, awakening and continuing expansion of consciousness, you investigate the self, and you automatically start investigating your past. Because who you are today is determined by the whole complete sum of everything you experienced from birth until now. And even considered in yoga what happened in previous lives, if you believe in the possibility of previous lives. Here, you start to connect the dots. You start to understand your traumas. You start to understand certain lack of characteristics. But you also start to understand good characteristics that you possess as a result of things that happened in the past, experiences that you went through in the past. Inevitably, there will be traumatic experiences, unpleasant experiences, painful experiences, but also very good, deep, helpful insights. When you start to connect the dots also, instead of considering traumatic experiences as a negative aspect of life, you actually start to see that without those experiences, without the suffering that came from the trauma, you would not be who you are today. Bad experiences in the long term, especially when you practice yoga, turn into good outcomes because it leads to a constructive development. Until then, all we do is suffer. Until then, those past experiences, traumas, they just on a daily basis make us suffer. And not only that, it keeps us from moving on in life. We stay stuck in certain patterns of work and relationship, and we see no way out. We are encapsulated in the past. The way we have been brought up, educated, but also all the experiences that we had keep us imprisoned. When you practice yoga, your awakening consciousness leads to insight. That's self-study. Those insights take time, of course, to evolve, to allow you to connect the dots. But it gives you more and more an insight into the law of cause and effect. You start to understand that one thing always leads to another. You start to see that action always leads to reaction, no matter how small. There's always a consequence. Karma yoga means being conscious of your past, karma, but that is not karma yet. I said that it is considered the highest stage of yoga, and it takes years to be fully settled in this condition. But based on your past insight, based on your deep ability to put the pieces of the puzzle into place, you start seeing the future. You develop the power of anticipation. Meaning, before you engage, you already realize what the consequences will be. If it is good, you may choose to allow it to happen. If it is bad, you can prevent yourself from going through more karma, from building more karma. Bad karma, that is. Can you see that? Situations in the past that I may blame on other people, because of my deeper insight, I understand that I was part of that process where things happened, and I may have been guilty. I may have triggered people to do things that hurt me or traumatized me. You start to see that. When you understand that in your past, you develop the ability to apply that ahead of you, in front of you. It's Not perfect science, but you develop the power of anticipation, allowing you to see, if I do this, or if I say that, this is what will come out of it. And then you learn, of course, to control. Yoga, after all, means control. Is the science of control, control of life. Sounds very complicated, but I will say again and again, all you have to do is practice your yoga. If you try to study this academically, you just get a headache. You have to practice yoga and it will come naturally. And what you learn in theory, philosophy, helps you to understand the developments that you go through. I'll try to explain as practically as possible what you can expect. So just practice yoga. And you don't even realize that you're already in this stage, or that you're already in that stage. And it's not that those stages are isolated, secluded. It's a very dynamic process. While you practice yoga, you start to see the light, jnana. But that light is not so bright yet in the beginning. But the fact that you are becoming more sensitive, more insightful, wiser, already gives you a glimmer of karma. You're not a karma yogi yet, but you already start to anticipate how things will unfold when certain things happen. Self-study is the result of this stage. Self-study. Self-study, self with a capital S. In the third paragraph, the first sentence says, every time we practice yoga, we get rid of impurities. What are impurities? It sounds very mysterious and maybe a little bit unpractical. But when we are born with a core that in yoga is considered to be the karma that is left from previous lives. The karma is not good, it's not bad, it's just the characteristics that you carry with you when you are born. It explains why I'm from a family of 7 children. Each of those children have their own typical characteristics. And it has nothing to do with my mom or dad, that we got their characteristics. Of course we have some, but then each child has their own distinct characteristics that cannot be explained unless you understand how karma works. But the moment you are born, you're also subject to outside impressions. From the moment you are born, you absorb everything your mom, your parents present you, in the way that they care for you, in the way that they talk with you. Those are impurities, because that's their characteristics that you absorb. In yoga, that is considered impurities. Education soon starts after you are born, where you absorb huge amounts of knowledge. It's not your knowledge, it's not your insight. I'm not saying that education is bad, although there are yogis who do. Education fulfills, in my opinion, the role that yoga did in the past, but has overshot the goal. by presenting you with a lot of information that you're not really interested in. And worse, it causes your energy to be blocked the moment that you are asked to memorize things and then do a test. Yoga is all about unblocking energy. So there are no tests in real yoga. Shouldn't be. So we grow up into adulthood, and from the karma that we were born with, the characteristics that we were born with, almost nothing is visible anymore, because we have been snowed under by huge amounts of information, impressions from the outside world that determine how we conduct ourselves in the present day. Education is a big influencer, but also culture. I'm Dutch. Being Dutch is very typical and different from British or Korean or American or Japanese. So culture has a huge, because in the end we are all the same. We're all a ball of energy, soul consciousness, but then it is colored. It is colored by upbringing, education, culture, very big. Like education, very big element of influence. And of course we live in a time of social media. Internet is a huge blessing, but it can be a curse too. Internet allows you, when I was a child, even when I was an adult, before I came to Korea, if you wanted information, you had to go to the library and search alphabetically on the subject that you're interested in. Or you had to have an encyclopedia at home, like huge encyclopedia, which cost a lot of money, but almost all households had encyclopedias in the past. Now you turn on your computer and you have information from all over the world. It's a blessing, it's huge. But there are forces for evil that put out a lot of information there that people take for true, but are not true, to manipulate people's minds. So it's a huge blessing, but it's also a bit of a curse. With most big developments, that is the case. We learned contentment last week, which teaches us to look at the bright side of things. That is important for your own mental health, really. Long story short, we end up being disconnected from those true characteristics that we were originally born with. The word disconnect is very often heard in society in all kinds of ways. We're disconnected from society, we're disconnected from ourselves, we're disconnected from nature. Try to look at it like this. You go up to a mountain, and on the top of the mountain you look down and you see a huge forest. But what do you really see? What you see is a sea of green. Nothing distinct. You don't see any typical plants or trees or flowers or even animals. You just see a sea of green. That is the condition that we are in a polluted state, full of impurities. So it's very difficult to see distinct features, characteristics. But now you start practicing yoga and you go through this process, developing insight naturally, with self-study becoming a natural, spontaneous occurrence. And now, it is like as if you come down the mountain, go into that forest, and you start looking at all the impurities. You start looking at your past and all the experiences, including your education and your upbringing, your family life, and your culture. You start looking at all those things. So, sticking to that picture of looking at this huge forest, you start looking at all these particular pieces of impurity and you clean them up. It's like cleaning up the forest. You start with the weeds on the forest floor. You cut out all the weeds, and when they're gone, you start seeing the smaller plants, bushes, and trees, and you clean them up. They're not yours, not your characteristics. Impurity, you clean them up. Then you see middle-sized trees. They're not yours. It doesn't feel belonging to you. So you cut them down and you remove all that. In the long term, you clean up all the impurities, and what remains are a couple of huge trees. They call them sequoia or redwood. Those are trees that are almost as high as the 63 building here in Yoido, more than 100 meters high, up to 130 meters high. It's just mind-boggling to even imagine a tree of that size. And the size of the trunk, it's bigger than a house. And there are sequoias that are like 2,000 years old. Those are your characteristics. Those are the characteristics that you were born with. And in the end, after having cleared all the brush, of course they stand out. You couldn't see them before because they were overgrown with all that other growth, all the other weeds and brush and smaller trees that you cleaned up over the years. And that is what you see, and that is what you can now work with. I'm simplifying how it works, but it is exactly the way that it works. Now you think, I want to know what my characteristics are. Yesterday, not tomorrow, yesterday, because now I'm very curious. And it doesn't work that way. We have to control our desire. That is why we learned non-desire. How do you get to those characteristics? The story remains the same. Practice. Practice yoga, do it correctly, and it will come to you naturally, even before you know it. When I started practicing yoga, I fell in love with it. That means it must have been related to one of those giant trees, my most important pieces of karma. And then, while I was practicing yoga every evening before sleep, came the time that I felt a need for something else. I became attracted to martial arts, and I chose Hapkido. Hapkido is Korean. It brought me to Korea. It's related to my sequoias. That is why I'm still here after 25 years. I didn't leave after 1 year or 2 years, thinking, oh, it was a nice experience, it was a nice adventure, time to go back to normal. So, it already starts in the early stages of your practice, but you must, if you don't practice, you will not connect. But if you practice, without you even knowing it, you're already connecting. It is so magical, it's so wonderful. So I'm imploring you, almost begging you, just practice. And if you can't practice every day, then practice several times a week. I am pretty certain that when you do practice on your own, it feels so good that that good feeling will be your motivation to do it again tomorrow, even though you find it difficult to have the discipline. But you will want to do it again tomorrow. And if tomorrow you have to skip because you're busy or got distracted, you will promise yourself, well, okay, not today, but tomorrow I will. And you will make time for it. And basically, that's all you have to do. We call this process burning up of karma, or burning up of impurities, cleaning up impurities. It sounds superficial, but I'm trying to give you very practical insight into how it works, because it really happens. Burning up of karma really happens. Cleaning up of impurities really happens before you even realize it. Provided that you practice yoga correctly. I cannot mention it enough. At the bottom you see concentrating on the Aum mantra is mental self-study. I did that in the beginning because that is how I learned it from Ajita. But then people think, concentrating on the Aum mantra, how do I do that? It's very simple. Maybe later I edited the text, I have the old one here. Maybe I edited and between brackets I said, Om equals meditation. Did I do that in the text? Sometimes I do, sometimes I didn't. But it's really about meditation. When I mention Om, just replace it by meditation, because that's what it means. Mental self-study of the self, mental study of the self means to follow your own path in life. I'm often giving examples of my own life. That is the only way that I can make it clear how it all works. Following your own path in life, in my case, started with the realization that to be happy, all I needed to do was not to get rich or to have a flourishing career. All I had to do was to be myself. Go back to being myself. That is where your path in life starts, in connection with your true karma or your true characteristics. Simply start being yourself. From today, whatever that may be, you feel sad, acknowledge it. You feel happy, acknowledge it. We live in a world where we're often oppressing what we feel, what we are, who we are. We have to stop doing that. And if that is not in line with what other people expect from you, you have to also realize that those people are not the right people to be with, even if that includes your own family or the friends that you have been socializing with since childhood. You will become a force in your own right. You will become a more pronounced individual with your own characteristics, standing out. And that is not a bad thing. That is how you reconnect. It is what in life is called a person being eccentric. And often when people use the word eccentric, they say that with a little bit of a negative undertone. But eccentric is not negative at all. People who are eccentric are, per definition, people who are above average conscious. Because what does eccentric mean? It means doing things differently, in your own way, regardless of what other people think of it. People who are eccentric are very mindful. They do everything in their own particular way because it has meaning for them to do it like that. Everything must have a logic, a common sense, a certain order. To eccentric people, if that common sense is lacking or that certain order is not there, they get disturbed. Because they are more sensitive than normal people. They're more conscious than normal people. So an eccentric is part of a yogi. As a yogi, you will, in your own way, become some level of eccentric. And that's a good thing. It shows that you're really on that path towards reconnecting with the self. Becoming stubborn. Yogis become naturally stubborn. You recognize that? Why? Because you know what you want. When you connect with yourself, you know what you stand for, you know what you want. You know what you think of things. Regardless of what other people want you to think or want you to do. So of course, you don't want to be an extremist. You don't want to be a radical, although most of us will go through a stage where we are. I have been, for sure. But then you mellow out. You realize that you cannot fight windmills like, what's his name again? Don Quixote, who tried to find windmills. The story of Don Quixote exists for this reason. Exactly for this reason. You can't fight windmills. They are not something to win from or to battle. So you realize that life is dynamic and that the best way to go through it is to stick to yourself, but not always to try to change this world. Because you cannot fight windmills. You cannot change things that are not your part or your responsibility. But in that period that you become an idealistic, which is part of yoga, that you can become a little bit fanatic, a little bit radical, there is a time that you will actually try to control things that you can't control, and it leads to frustration, it leads to bumping with your head into brick walls, and you learn from that. You learn, and yogis that have been on the path for a long time, in India, your name changes with your level of development. And many old yogis have Ananda in their name, and Ananda is love, pure love. Why, as an old yogi, you have Ananda to your name? Because your center of gravity of how you function, in the end, will be from the heart. More and more from the heart. More and more with love, compassion, empathy. Well, it takes some time to get there. It's a natural development. There's an extra note, the last paragraph on page 3, extra note about karma. Karma is not as simple as many people think. Many people consider karma to be a bad thing, bad karma. But the word means do. not just do, but in relation to the law of cause and effect. So everything is karma. There is no good and bad in yoga. What is the consequence of certain events. Energy is just like that. If you move it by a word, by an action, even by a thought, energy moves. It creates ripples, it creates waves that will lead to a consequence, a reaction. Karma is deeply embedded in us. You know, let me give you an anecdote that kind of baffled me later when I understood what happened. When I was in my 20s, I would go with my brothers to southern France. I tried to get them away from the destructive environment they were in. So for a month we would spend on a camping on the Mediterranean Sea, southern France. And one of those vacations we were on a beach where from inland there was a stream that cut through the beach and deposited its water into the sea. And it was just a small stream because there was not much rain around that time. When there's lots of rain in other seasons, that stream becomes a small river. But it was a very small stream. And without giving it a second thought, one of my brothers and I, we started to canalize that stream. And there was this French man with a pipe in his mouth, very typical French man with a pipe in his mouth, and he stood there with his hands behind his back, just observing. At some point he scratched his chin and he said, "Vous êtes Hollandais? You must be Dutch." Why did he say that? Well, why did we start canalizing that stream? Because Dutch people, since time immemorial, have had issues with water. Our country is under the sea. And throughout the centuries, we have been busy trying to control the water to make our lives bearable. Building dikes, building huge systems to control the water, even creating land out of water. It's in my genes. Because now everything is under control, but some hundreds of years ago, people lived with a terrible fear that they could die from some form of flooding, that they could drown. Out of fear, we took action and we shaped the sea and the land to such extent that we can live relatively safe lives. What happened there on the beach in France is that karma kicked in. We saw water and that urge to control that water. And this Frenchman in his own way just understood that can only be Dutch people that are doing this, because other people would just let it flow. So each culture, Korean culture, American culture, British culture, Indian culture, we all have our own karma, and you will discover that too. You will see that too. If you don't believe in previous lives, karma from previous lives, you don't have to, as long as you don't believe in it. But you will see that more and more things will appear in your realizations that will kind of indicate that it's impossible that it does not exist. That there are influences from hundreds of years ago that determine what you do today. That is also why each culture or people from each different culture are different, are typically different. Karma, one of the underlying purposes of yoga is to get rid of karma. But that's not only yoga. That's basically all spiritual practices and religious practices have this goal of getting rid of karma. That is why in holy books there is some form of a story where humankind fell from paradise. The story in the Bible is such that there was a paradise, there's Adam and Eve, which are not people but energies, yin and yang, Shiva and Shakti. It's a mistake that many people make, that they do not understand that Adam and Eve are actually those two opposing energies. That is the story that in yoga says, first there was only pure sattva. There was only Aum, the vibration of Aum, with pure harmony. As long as there is harmony, there is no manifestation of matter. We are spirit. Spirit was in total harmony, so we did not manifest into a physical body. Bones and muscle and skin. But when energy became disturbed, as a result of what we call subtle desire, we fell from paradise. Sattva was disturbed. The yin-yang energy, the balance between the Shiva and Shakti energy became disturbed. So we started, our energy, our spirit started to condense. Energy becomes gas, gas becomes liquid, liquid becomes solid matter. And that is what our bodies exist of. The purpose of all spiritual and religious practices is in fact to go back to paradise. And how do you do that? By getting rid of karma. So the story goes, in Buddhism especially, the story is very distinct. Every life that you live, you burn more karma. One day you will have burned it all, and you will not be reborn anymore. You will not reincarnate anymore. Buddhists say it will cost you at least 1 million lives that you have to go through and experience misery to find your way back to paradise again. But the reason why Buddhists say that you have to go through at least 1 million lives of experiencing misery is because we are ignorant. We don't do the work necessary to evolve and burn karma because we get distracted by daily life, by ego, by desires. The reason why we fell from paradise in the first place. We keep making the same mistake again. So as long as we remain in that condition of ignorance, we spend many lives without much progress. Therefore, Buddhists say you must live, reincarnate 1 million times. the good thing of the story, not to make you pessimistic, the good thing is that when you practice yoga, it's like a turbo boost on your path of evolution. You skip a huge amount of those million lives by turning ignorance into jnana, into wisdom. That is a little bit idealistic, and it is something that you should not focus on. Do not make this the purpose of your life, that next life or someday you may actually go back to paradise. Try to be in paradise here and now today, simply by being a good person. How do you do that? You are a good person based on your insights, how action causes reaction. And if you detect the possibility of negativity, you try to avoid it if you can. Nothing is perfect. Sometimes things happen that could not have been avoided, but then you turn it into a learning moment. When things happen that could not be avoided, or because you were not aware of it, it's simply something that you learn from and grow. Questions? Overwhelmed? Difficult? Let me know. I know that I bombard you with a huge amount of data, information, but I also know that you slowly digest it in the days to come, and that it all falls into place. But if you have questions, let me know, don't hesitate. And in the end, if you feel overwhelmed, go back to your practice. Just focus on your practice. That is, after all, the most important element of what you do. The rest is a natural consequence of the foundation that you lay and the transformation that you trigger as a result of regular practice, fairly regular practice. And the rest is a matter of time, patience. Put into practice your yamas and niyamas, non-desire among them. Truthfulness, be honest about everything, not only towards other people, but to yourself, about what you think you know, for example. Okay, let's have a short break, then we continue with asana practice.